so beautiful.
It's only because I'm so in love.
No. No, it's because I'm so in love with you.
Subtlety is important when writing characters. When they're speaking, characters shouldn't be saying exactly what they're thinking. There should be room for mystery and for interpretation by the viewer. For a long time, video game protagonists were just that, protagonists. You could hardly call them characters. At the time, for the most part, they served as self-inserts, with a few exceptions. To keep protagonists as blank a slate as possible, most of the time they wouldn't speak, so most characters fell into one of two categories. The silent self-insert, or characters with a little more depth. There was some overlap here, but most of the time that was for the sake of making the player feel cool, like in Metal Gear or something. Ness, however, is one that beat the system, one that is a perfect overlap between the self-insert and the actual character. Now, before we can truly explain why Ness is a perfect silent protagonist, we need to define some parameters here. For example, what makes a good character? The first thing is characterization. These are the things that make up a character on an external level, like how they dress, how they walk, and the manner in which they speak. And the second is contradiction, or conflict. As weird as this sounds, characters do need to contradict themselves. For example, Hamlet is all about being a triumphant and courageous hero, yet has no qualms with hiding behind a curtain so that he can stab his uncle when his guard is down. Courage and cowardice in the same body. This cognitive dissonance is what gives characters dimension, and the more dimension a character has, the more depth they'll have, and the more engaging character they'll be. Without these things, they're not characters, they're robots, and not even the good kind. So then, what makes a silent character? Well, they don't speak. Now this shouldn't be confused with they don't express themselves. A silent character can express their feelings and thoughts, just not through speech. Now the next and harder thing to define is what makes a video game a video game. To be as concise as possible, I am going to define a video game in this way. A video game is a digital piece of art in which the experience is defined in some way by the gameplay. It somehow tells the story, communicates emotions, and so on. But the gameplay in some way has to actually impact the outcome. That's it. All else is complementary. This isn't to suggest that elements like story, world, or even characters aren't also important, but they're frosting on the cake. And all these things in some way should be in service to the gameplay. At its bare bones, that is what fundamentally separates video games from other art forms. So, with all of that out of the way, what makes Ness a great silent protagonist? For most of the game, he's a blank slate. Works well for a self-insert, but how is he a complex character himself? Yeah, we know a lot about his surroundings, but we know very little about him personally and how he feels about them. He doesn't speak outside of yes-no commands, and actually reacts to things very rarely. The most emotion we see out of this boy is when he rides his bike. The players let in on very little of what Ness thinks himself. These moments are sprinkled throughout the game, at the sanctuary locations, where text tells the player the thoughts that are flashing in and out of Ness's head. Little does the player know that all of these instances of his thoughts being divulged are actually foreshadowing a major revelation later. The first true instance of the player being let in on what Ness thinks himself is the Looming Hall, the second to last sanctuary location. His thoughts are projected on the wall, and even that is left to interpretation if they're really his or not. And for good reason. It gives the player a very brief, personal interaction with Ness before the total invasion of privacy the player will be given of him after they reach their final sanctuary location. Once this is done, the player is treated to a cutscene of Ness entering his childhood home, presented in grayscale to imply that the visuals being presented are at least somewhat a memory. And as the camera shows the interior, it's revealed to the player that all of those thoughts they read Ness had at each location were alluding to this moment, building up to the true reveal of who he is, which is presented to the player following this cutscene in the form of Magicant, a perfect mesh of character and gameplay without Ness ever saying a word. Well, at least the actual Ness. The first thing we should acknowledge is the symbolism of nudity in Magicant. In Japanese culture, it's very common for characters to be nude when having a metaphysical experience that results in a major character change, and is likewise meant to invoke thoughts of being reborn in some way. Magicant takes place within Ness's mind, and now it's time for him to confront things about himself that he's been running from the entire adventure. So well, in fact, that not even the player knew about them. This section of the game allows you to talk to many characters that you've met along your journey, and in doing so reveals how Ness really feels about these characters. Most of the things people here have to say to Ness are quite bleak and sad. Some are even bittersweet depending on your interpretation. The player is even given Ness's honest thoughts about himself, both instances of which being quite critical. And the effects these characters have on Ness mentally are reflected in the changing color palette of the map. So why would the writer put all of these thoughts of regret and loss in this young boy's mind? Well, I think it goes back to Shigesato Itoi himself. Despite the fact that this game is largely about an American youth, it still comes from the perspective of someone from Japan. A place where, for the most part, kids are just expected to grow up much faster than other places, and are often encouraged to always put others before any of their own desires. Now, I'm not trying to make any statements about whether this worldview is right or wrong, but there's no doubt that it's had its effects on a toy's perception of children. As Ness heads north, leaving the city of Magicant, he arrives at the House of the Flying Men. Here, Ness can talk to one of the Flying Men, and each will introduce themselves to him as his courage and join him on his quest. And they'll fight alongside Ness in battles until they're killed in combat. I use the word killed here very intentionally. Ness's courage doesn't get its head handed to it. It dies. When a Flying Man dies, they're given a tombstone outside of the Flying Men's house. Just to the right, the grave of Buzz, the character that accompanies Ness for a short while at the beginning of the game, is also present. The choice to put Buzz's tomb right next to Ness's so-called courage is a very intentional one, and it reveals to the player just how great this amount of self-doubt Ness has had throughout the entire adventure has been. Once one Flying Man dies, Ness can have another join him. And with each one that gets killed, the next one is a bit more weary, nonetheless still completely willing to join Ness on his journey. This is also reflected in the epitaphs of the Flying Men's gravestones that read, "Ness's courage is resting here. He fought well, then died." Another one of Ness's courage is resting here. He damaged evil terribly, and finally died. Here he rests. I didn't have time to have his name chiseled into the tombstone. Someone's tombstone. And finally, "Of course we're your courage, but we warned you not to treat us like trash. Didn't you get it? This isn't courage, it's desperation. If you don't understand courage, look it up in the dictionary, okay? My name's the Final Flying Man." This reveals that throughout a large portion of the adventure, Ness has been mistaking his front of confidence for his actual courage. Just examining the Flying Man as a symbol for Ness's courage being a concealer for his cowardice, they're called the Flying Men. Men cannot fly. It is a delusion. And it's only through the repeated beating of this delusion that Ness realizes this. It's just as much of a delusion as the song that plays whenever a Flying Man is in your party. When taking a deeper look at its jaunty rhythm and beat, hearing the official vocals of this theme from Mother 1, you can clearly hear that it's the same notes as the bass line to the EarthBound Game Over theme. Okay, maybe that part about the music isn't necessarily done through gameplay, but I thought it was worth mentioning. As Ness reaches the end of the outskirts of Magicant, referred to by the player's guide as the Red Tunnel, he reaches a large silver tentacle that he must check to enter the final area. Now, your interpretation of this might differ depending on the localization you've played, but I'm going to give you mine, which is based on the original Mother 2. So here we have a tentacle. You know what else has a silver tentacle, and even several? The steel octopi statues that have been spread throughout the overworld. Statues that have been placed by Gygus and his army. For these reasons, I think this tentacle is meant to symbolize Ness's own internal conflicts with Gygus. Throughout the entire game, Gygus' influence has been turning normally peaceful beings into violent monsters, including people. So what makes Ness different? He's not. He just has the magical capabilities to be able to better suppress the evil influences than others. And by having to interact with it, to check it to go to the next area, Ness is acknowledging that he must take hold of his evils in his head that Gygus is attempting to spread throughout the rest of him. This is why this also acts as the entrance to Ness's subconscious, where people's primal, animalistic thoughts live. And with that, Ness enters the Sea of Eden. Now, we need to take a moment here to break down the greater elements of this scene so that we can better understand how this part of the game expresses its story through visuals and gameplay to create a greater experience. Earlier in Magicant near the Flying Man's house, the Star Master appears, and tells Ness that the Sea of Eden is filled with ultimate intelligence and is a place where you can touch the center of the universe, and that he can't go there unless he's truly ready. Understanding that the Sea of Eden is Ness's subconscious, we can draw these meanings from what the Star Master says. That it's the center of the universe of Ness as a person, and destroying the evils that lurk within his subconscious is a means to self-actualization. The Sea of Eden is filled with ultimate intelligence because at large, the things that live in the subconscious tell you a lot about who you really are. And that being changed is you changing as a person. And you can't make a change of this nature unless you're truly ready to face the challenges associated with it. And seeing and finally admitting to yourself who you really are, and that you need to change, can bring great pain and sorrow. As one might guess, the Sea of Eden is a large body of water. The water in this case is an allegory for Ness himself. Water is fluid and is constantly changing shape, and only in its stillness can finally take its temporary shape, at least until it changes again. The so-called shape of Ness is being disturbed by the thrashing krakens and are thus preventing Ness from taking shape as who he really is. These krakens are violent beasts and visually demonstrate Ness's internal battle with Gygus, a kraken being a monster Ness had to fight earlier in the adventure. one that also was inhabiting a large body of water, a sea, drawing parallels between the purity of Ness and the purity of Mother Earth being tainted by evil. The Krakens disrupting the shape of water symbolizes the way Gygas is changing Ness for the worse. Contrasted by after all three are defeated, Ness is the only one with any authority over the water's changing shape, which conversely symbolizes Ness's self-made changes as a person. Now, how does this translate into gameplay? You fight them, and are more than likely using the Magicant bat that was in the red tunnel. The Magicant bat is also the strongest reliable weapon you can have at this point, and suggests this general idea of mind over matter. Being that Magicant is in Ness's mind, the Magicant bat is likewise a creation of Ness's imagination, showing how truly his greatest weapon is also his mind, for better or worse. And by defeating these Krakens, Ness's inner demons, you're rewarded with experience points. In the most literal interpretation of that terminology ever, by conquering Ness's personal evils, he is literally growing stronger. Regardless of the Krakens being defeated, however, Ness is still at odds with his nightmare, which literally has the high ground. Observing its appearance, Ness's nightmare resembles a large Oscar award with horns, which suggests a corrupt, elitist system, the system in this case being Ness, how he works. And this is further supported by the battle-engaging text. The statue stands as an award, symbolizing the self-affirming actions of negative, selfish choices, which are often easier to habituate, rather than changing to try to be better. As unfortunate as it is, it's not uncommon for manipulative and otherwise bad people to get much further ahead than good people in life. This is why Ness's nightmare already knows Rock and Omega, regardless if the player has unlocked it themselves or not. And it's even very likely, in fact, that most players won't have it at this point. A common topic when discussing Ness's nightmare is the difficulty of the battle. It's one of the toughest endurance matches of the entire adventure. But have you ever noticed that Ness's nightmare fights like an EarthBound player? It's constantly spamming its strongest attacks and then healing. And because of the way it strategizes in battle and has these super strong attacks, you as the player are forced to suffer it. To suffer yourself. Again, completely intertwining the story elements directly to the gameplay. When the battle concludes, Ness gains one of the highest experience points yields in the entire game. Technically Diamond Dog gives more, but when talking about the amount given to an individual person, Ness's nightmare narrowly outdoes it. This massive reward shows his inner battles were some of his toughest yet, and when you return to the overworld, something happens. You hear Ness's thoughts, and yes, these are thoughts, not spoken words. The game even goes out of its way to make this clear. Ness really heard his own voice. And this leads to the culmination of all of the ingenious game design decisions made throughout Magicant, what players often refer to as the Magicant bonus. Ness receives a massive buff across all of his stats, coming from each of his sanctuary locations, drawing parallels to them being the places where Ness first had his premonitions that manifested into Magicant. And then, Ness gains 200,000 experience points, the largest XP yield in the entire game. Not in any artificial way, actual experience points that end up giving most players a massive buff that helps them throughout the rest of the game. This moment is a perfect example of all of the elements of video game design coming together in perfect harmony to create a purely artistic experience in the form of video games. Ness's internal character growth manifests into an actual reward for the player. It perfectly delivers the message that by confronting and conquering your greatest internal battles, you become both a stronger and better person. And no matter how large an adversity you face in the outside world, the toughest battles in your life are on the inside. Becoming a better person is hard work. It requires much more effort on your part than anyone else, and oftentimes goes underappreciated. But in the end, it's not for someone else. It isn't all about improving others' perceptions of you. And just like in Magicant, there's only one person who can truly initiate that change. The main character. You.